Well, there were three of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Missing piece of the jigsaw, Diana's fears that she'd be murdered. That fits in with what Alfai had said. It also fits in with...
There were three of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Princess Diana's voice echoed through history, a quiet but deadly warning. At the time, the world saw it as a bitter confession, her way of exposing the affair that had shattered her fairy tale. But Diana was never one to tell the full story outright. She left breadcrumbs, hints, and subtle warnings buried beneath her carefully chosen words. And now, decades later, the missing piece of her truth has finally been uncovered. It was supposed to be just another day in the royal archives. Rows upon rows of untouched documents, files so old they had turned brittle with time. But in 2024, a group of archivists sorting through decades of royal correspondence stumbled upon something that made their hands tremble. A worn, leather-bound diary, its edges frayed from age, its pages filled with handwritten confessions. The unmistakable script belonged to only one person, Diana, the people's princess, and what she had written, what she had been desperate to record, was enough to shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. This wasn't an official document. It wasn't a memoir meant for public consumption. It was something far more intimate, more dangerous. A raw, unfiltered window into the mind of a woman who had been trapped behind palace walls, fighting battles that no one could see. These weren't the words of a paranoid princess. They were the words of a woman who knew too much. A woman who had been silenced for speaking the truth. She wrote of gaslighting so severe that she began to question her sanity, of mind games designed to keep her in check, of a power so insidious that even she feared for her life. At first, experts hesitated. The implications were too great. If this diary was real, it would confirm everything Diana had been accused of exaggerating. The paranoia, the conspiracies, the constant fear that she was being watched, manipulated, pushed toward an inevitable end. But then came the verification of the handwriting experts, the forensic analysts, and the historians who compared every stroke of ink to Diana's letters and notes from her time in the palace. The evidence was undeniable. It was real, and more than that, it was damning. For years, the royal family dismissed Diana's claims as hysteria, the delusions of a woman too fragile for the pressures of royalty. But now, her own words had been resurrected, and they painted a picture far darker than anyone had imagined. She wrote of being followed by unknown figures, of finding objects in her room mysteriously misplaced, of phone calls with nothing but silence on the other end. She wrote of conversations overheard, whispered warnings from those who worked behind the scenes, and hints that she was running out of time. And most chilling of all, she wrote of the day she realized she would never be allowed to leave the monarchy unscathed. For decades, this diary had been buried beneath layers of royal secrecy, hidden away under decades of paperwork, locked away where no one would ever find it. But why? Who wanted it silenced? Who had decided that Diana's truth should never see the light of day? And more importantly, what were they so afraid of? The world thought they knew Diana's story, but this diary changes everything. It is more than just a glimpse into the past. It is a warning, a final, desperate attempt from beyond the grave to tell the truth that she was never allowed to say out loud. And now that it has been revealed, there is no turning back. But before we reveal what Diana feared most, let's go back to the moment she realized she was trapped. She was only 19 when she walked through the grand gates of the royal world, a young girl with dreams of love, devotion, and a life that, from the outside, seemed destined for perfection. The cameras adored her, the people embraced her, and the palace, it welcomed her with rehearsed smiles and calculated words. But behind the gilded walls, beneath the weight of the crown, Diana was not stepping into a fairy tale. She was walking into a prison. And she would soon learn that there were no exits. At first it was subtle. The rules, the formalities, the cold precision of a life governed by centuries-old traditions. She was told when to speak, how to walk, how to sit, and even how long to pause before answering a question. It wasn't guidance, it was control, a carefully crafted script where she was expected to perform, not live. And the more she tried to find her voice, the more suffocating the world around her became. Her phone calls were monitored, her letters screened, and her conversations watched. Nothing was truly private. There were whispers in the hallways, unseen figures in the shadows, and a quiet but ever-present force ensuring that she remained in line. Diana described it best in her own words. They create deserts and call them security. They told her it was for her protection, that every precaution was taken to keep her safe. But safe from what? The very people she was meant to trust? Her friends slowly disappeared. Relationships outside the palace were discouraged and then cut off completely. Every attempt to maintain a life beyond the royal walls was met with resistance, a firm but gentle reminder that her duty was to the crown, not herself. She was alone, and that was exactly how they wanted her. But Diana was no ordinary princess. She was not built to be silent. As she struggled against the invisible chains wrapped around her, she began to see the truth. She was not a cherished member of the royal family. She was a pawn, carefully placed, carefully controlled, and ultimately expendable. Every movement, every decision, every moment of her life had been orchestrated for a purpose greater than herself. And it had nothing to do with love. And then came the cruelest betrayal, the moment Diana understood she was never meant to be Charles's wife, only his cover story. The world saw a royal love story, a young, radiant princess and a future king standing side by side, the picture of elegance and tradition. But behind closed doors, behind the grand palaces and glittering jewels, there was no love story. There was only deception. From the very beginning, Diana was never the woman Charles truly wanted. She was chosen, not cherished. And that realization would become her greatest heartbreak. Even before the wedding, the shadows of betrayal loomed over Diana. She noticed the phone calls Charles quickly ended when she entered the room. The hushed tones, the way his eyes would drift away when she spoke. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, that it was just nerves, that every bride-to-be had moments of doubt. But then, she found the bracelet. A delicate piece of jewelry, carefully engraved with two interwoven letters, C, not Diana's initials, Camilla's. Charles's final gift before he walked down the aisle to marry another woman. Diana was expected to ignore it, to play her role, to be grateful for the crown placed on her head. But how could she when Camilla's presence was everywhere, at public events, in whispered phone calls, in the way Charles would slip away to secret meetings? Diana wasn't his wife, she was his shield. A carefully chosen bride who would keep up appearances while his heart belonged elsewhere. When she finally confronted him and demanded to know the truth, she was met with cold indifference. He didn't deny it. He didn't even bother to lie. Instead, he told her the truth with chilling simplicity. Camilla had always been part of his life. That was never going to change. But the palace couldn't afford a scandal. Is a future queen openly voicing her heartbreak, her humiliation? That was unacceptable. So they turned the tables on her. The mind games began, subtle at first, then relentless. The whispers in the press, the carefully planted rumors Diana was unstable, overly emotional, and prone to exaggeration. Every tear she shed, every moment of sadness was twisted into evidence that she was fragile, hysterical, incapable of handling the pressures of royal life. She was being gaslighted at the highest level, manipulated into questioning her reality. She saw the truth, but every time she spoke it, she was told she was imagining things. Charles didn't love Camilla, she was being paranoid, there were no secret phone calls, she was overreacting. The press wasn't turning against her, she was being dramatic. It was a systematic effort to isolate her, to break her down until she doubted herself. But Diana was not paranoid, she was being watched, and worse, she was being silenced. The fear began as a whisper, a lingering sense that something wasn't right. At first, Diana tried to dismiss it. She told herself she was imagining things, that the paranoia was just a side effect of the relentless scrutiny she endured every day. But the signs were there too many to ignore. A misplaced item in her room, a car that always seemed to be following her, phone calls with nothing but silence on the other end. And then, she found the microphone, hidden inside a vase in her living quarters, a silent reminder that even in her most private moments, she was never truly alone. Diana documented everything, every unsettling moment, every inexplicable event, every creeping fear. Her diary became more than just a collection of thoughts. It was a record, a desperate attempt to leave behind proof in case something happened to her. Brake failures on her car, security cameras mysteriously disabled, and staff members suddenly replaced without warning. Some might have called her paranoid, but 3 former security officers would later come forward and say the same thing. Diana's fears were not unfounded. They had seen it too. The strange men lurking outside the palace gates, the sudden changes in security protocols. The orders were to watch her, monitor her movements, and report everything she did. But report to whom and why? The palace's response was as cold as it was calculated. Silence. Denial. More control. Every concern she voiced was met with the same dismissive tone she was imagining it. She was overreacting. She was just being dramatic. But Diana knew better. She had spent years being told she was crazy, only to find out she had been right all along. And now, with every passing day, her fear was growing stronger. In one of her final entries, she wrote the words that would haunt the world for decades to come. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." She was right to be afraid, but Diana wasn't just trying to save herself. She was fighting to protect the two people she loved most. Diana was many things: a princess, a humanitarian, a symbol of hope for millions. But before all of that, she was a mother. And in a world where tradition dictated every move, where duty always came before personal desires, her greatest act of defiance was choosing love over protocol. The monarchy had a system, one that had raised future kings for generations. It was cold, distant, and built on rigid discipline and strict detachment. Children were not to be coddled, not to be treated as individuals. They were heirs, raised by nannies, molded by the firm hands of royal tutors, and shaped into symbols rather than human beings. But Diana refused to let William and Harry be just symbols. From the moment they were born, she fought for them. She rejected the idea that they should be raised by strangers and that their childhood should be sacrificed for duty. She wanted them to feel normal, to have real experiences, to know a world beyond the palace gates. Public schools instead of private tutors, trips to amusement parks instead of royal estates, McDonald's instead of 5-course meals served on silver trays. Every small act of rebellion sent shockwaves through the royal family. A future king standing in line for a cheeseburger? Unthinkable. But to Diana, it was necessary. "They expect me to hand my boys over to nannies. I refuse." She held them close, hugged them in public, and kissed them on the forehead in front of the cameras. Acts that might seem ordinary to most, but in the royal world they were nothing short of revolutionary. She showed them kindness, warmth, and above all, a love that could not be controlled by the crown. The palace had a plan for William. He was the heir, the future king. Every decision about his life was carefully curated, every step predetermined. And then there was Harry, the spare. The insurance policy. That was the monarchy's view of him. Important, but not essential. But to Diana, her boys were equals. She saw them not as their titles, not as pieces in a game, but as her purpose, her reason for enduring the loneliness, the manipulation, the pain. And then, the darkest thought began to creep in, the fear that one day she wouldn't be there to protect them, that the same machine that had broken her, the same system that had controlled her, would one day take them too. She had seen what it did to people who didn't fit the mold. She had lived it. If she disappeared, if she was no longer there to shield them, who would protect them from the forces waiting to shape them into something they were never meant to be? And that's when she decided to escape. But leaving wasn't going to be easy. Diana was done waiting, done hoping that things would change. The royal family had stripped her of love, freedom, and trust, but they would not take her future. She had spent years trapped within the walls of a life she never wanted, playing a role designed to suffocate her. But now, she had a plan. She would leave. Not just the palace, not just the country, but the entire monarchy. And this time, they wouldn't stop her. America, a place where titles meant nothing, where she could finally breathe. It wasn't just a dream, it was a carefully crafted escape. Diana had begun secretly viewing real estate in New York, properties tucked away from the public eye, places where she could disappear, where William and Harry could experience a childhood beyond the grip of royal control. Every trip to the US wasn't just a vacation, it was reconnaissance, a step toward breaking free. She met with trusted allies, people outside the palace's reach, those who could help her vanish without a trace. She knew what she was up against. If she left recklessly, they would cut her off financially, strip her of protection, and turn her into a powerless exile. So she prepared. She secured hidden funds. Money the palace couldn't touch. Jewelry was discreetly converted into liquid assets. Private accounts opened beyond royal oversight. Every detail had to be airtight. She had learned from past betrayals no one could be fully trusted. She collected proof, letters, tapes, confidential documents, evidence that, if necessary, could be used as leverage. If they tried to silence her, she would make sure the truth was heard. But the closer she got to freedom, the more obstacles appeared. Quiet warnings from those who knew too much. Staff members were mysteriously dismissed. Conversations that ended when she entered the room. She wasn't being paranoid, she was being watched. And then, her diary took a darker turn. The final entries were not plans, they were warnings. The warnings had been there for years. Whispers in the halls, strange glances from those who once served her, and subtle but deliberate signs that something was closing in. But in her final weeks, those warnings were no longer whispers, they were deafening. Diana knew. She had always known. And on August 30, 1997, she wrote the words that would haunt history forever. They found their perfect moment. The sense of doom had been creeping in, tightening its grip around her. She felt watched, more than usual. Familiar faces in her security detail had suddenly been replaced by new ones, men she didn't recognize, men who didn't speak much. She noticed the same car, a small white Fiat, appearing again and again in different cities, in different countries, always lingering just out of reach. She voiced her concerns and told those closest to her that she feared something was being orchestrated. But who would listen? To the outside world, she was paranoid, unstable, and prone to dramatics. But Diana had spent a lifetime being dismissed, only for the truth to reveal itself too late. Her biggest fear wasn't just death, it was silence. She had spent years fighting to tell her story, exposing the cracks within the monarchy, and refusing to play the part she had been assigned. She had become a threat not because of what she had done, but because of what she knew. And the more she tried to break free, the clearer it became that she was running out of time. Would they let her go? Would they allow her to live beyond the walls of royalty, free to speak, free to reveal what lay beneath the polished surface of the crown? She had her answer: the streets of Paris, a black Mercedes, a sudden chase through the tunnels, the crash, the flashing lights, the wreckage, the headlines that followed, tragic accident. But was it? Or did Diana's greatest fear come true? Now that her diary has been revealed, one question remains: what happens next? They thought they had silenced her. That time would erase the questions, and history would smooth over the cracks. But Diana's truth was never meant to die in a Paris tunnel. She had left behind something more powerful than any headline, stronger than any royal denial: her own words. A trail of evidence, carefully documented, warnings written in ink, a diary filled with confessions too damning to be ignored. And now, the world was finally listening. The revelation of Diana's secret diary sent shockwaves through the royal family. The carefully crafted narrative, the decades of dismissal, the attempts to paint her as paranoid, it was all unraveling. Former staff members, once bound by duty and fear, were speaking out. They confirmed what had long been suspected, that Diana had been watched, manipulated, controlled. Security officers who had worked within the palace walls now admitted to seeing the same patterns of strange surveillance, the quiet but undeniable efforts to keep Diana contained. And so the question remains: what happens now? The monarchy has spent years trying to control Diana's story, to dictate what the world remembers of her. But can they bury the truth again? Or will her final words, the warnings she fought so hard to leave behind, finally bring justice? The world is watching, and this time Diana's voice won't be silenced. What shocked you most about Diana's diary? Do you believe her fate was sealed long before that night in Paris? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more shocking royal truths.